And I thought, here I've been working with this generation for years and I don't even know them. I do not recognize the ideology of a person who would literally say that it is okay to slaughter, rape, and mutilate civilians if you're mad. But that's what's going on.
Hey friend, welcome to the Truth Changes Everything podcast. As you know, this is the show where we explore how God is at work changing everything through Jesus, who is the incarnation of the truth. Today we have a special episode for you. I recently spoke at Calvary Chapel Chattanooga, where I was asked to speak about my latest book, Should Christians Support Israel? So instead of doing an interview today, I wanted to share this presentation with you. I care deeply about this topic, both because of Israel, but because of the significance of helping the rising generation avoid indoctrination and understand the truth. So if you find the content helpful, would you share this particular show with a friend? We want more people to understand the times as we follow Jesus. Now let's listen to the program.
Good evening. Thank you, Adam, for that introduction. I wanted to say a word about the ministry that I have the privilege of leading, Summit Ministries, because one of our two campuses is just up the road here on the campus of Covenant College. This summer, nearly 600 students had the opportunity to learn a biblical worldview from some of America's top Christian thought leaders who love Jesus and want to lead them toward the truth, and it happened right here just a few miles from your campus. It's a privilege to lead that ministry because you probably are aware that only about 1% of Gen Z, the rising generation between 12 and say 25 years of age, only 1%, according to the social researcher George Barna, have a biblical worldview in the United States of America. That's where we are in our nation at this time. So it is an incredible privilege to invite them either to the campus up at Covenant or out to our campus in Manitou Springs, which is a little hippie town that's right at the foot of Pikes Peak, if you've ever been out there. Those two programs bring in the Christian thought leaders, use discussion, lectures, Q&A sessions, and all kinds of things to help young adults find answers, to find the truth in a time like this. And by the time they leave, 95% of them say they claim a biblical worldview. 95%. Now, I think that's very exciting, but you could also say, hey, I've been to camp too. I know how excited you are when you come home. For about 24 hours, you're totally on fire for Jesus. What about later? So we hired another research company, all independent researchers, to study our graduates every year, to study those who came a year ago, those who came 5 years ago, and those who came 10 years ago. And we have found that even 10 years out, 85% stay strong in their biblical worldview. So clearly I have the best job in the entire world, right? Because it's to be able to bring people to a knowledge of the truth in a way that shapes them as young leaders for the rest of their lives is an amazing mission. And that's what we do at Summit Ministries, and we would love to participate with you. We'd love to have your family and friends participate in that program. And then if you go to summit.org, you can also find other resources that we have available for churches, for Christian schools, for homeschool co-ops, and this is new, we now have our Summit Ministries worldview curriculum being taught in 300 public schools in 12 states. Where those students get to leave their regular classroom for 1 hour every day to study biblical worldview with us. So it's an incredibly exciting time. 70,000 young people have participated in our various programs throughout this last year. But tonight we're going to talk about the church in Israel. And it does have to do with the rising generation. 3.5 weeks ago, the book that Adam mentioned to you, Should Christians Support Israel, was distributed to members of Congress. Every single member of Congress was personally handed a copy the morning before Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke in Congress. So it was, and they were thankful. 88% of the members of Congress claim to be Christians. It's hard to imagine with the voting records of some of them. but they do. And they want to know what is the biblical case, what is the Christian case, as well as the historical and the factual case for supporting Israel. Well, I was not able to be there on that day, unfortunately, because I'd love to have been there when the book was being distributed and to listen to the Prime Minister speak. But I was able to arrive the next day. Right outside of Union Station, which is the main transit point for people who have work related to the Capitol or the Supreme Court. Right outside of Union Station is a large monument to Christopher Columbus. In fact, what it says, it's hard to read, but I put it on the side. The memory of Christopher Columbus, whose high faith and indomitable courage gave to mankind a new world. That also has a replica of the Liberty Bell right in front of it. On the day that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke, this is what the monument looked like. Most obviously painted right there in the middle, Hamas is coming. Those protesters knew exactly what they were doing. They are not advocating for beleaguered Palestinians. They are supporting intentionally a terrorist agenda. What is going on with Hamas, and how is it connected to what is happening in the progressive left that you saw on campuses in Washington, D.C. on that day and this last week outside of the Democratic National Convention? To understand that, we need to go back in history a very long ways, more than 3,000 years, all the way back to 1150 BC. You see there it says, "Free Gaza." The first person to think about conquering Gaza was not an Israeli citizen. It wasn't somebody from the IDF. It was a guy named Samson. Now, I don't know if you remember this account from the book of Judges, but Samson was a vile man, very powerful, but vile. He went to Gaza to visit a prostitute. The scripture specifically specifies that it was in Gaza. He went to Gaza to visit a prostitute. He heard a rumor that while he was there, the men of Gaza would come during the night and tie him up and capture him. So at midnight, he arose from the prostitute's bed, went out to the city gates. The scripture says that he tore the city gates and the gate posts away from the city. Then he carried them, scripture says, to a hill overlooking Hebron. This is something that would escape most people who haven't tracked the narrative of scripture up to that point. But Hebron is 36 miles away from where Samson was that night. He carried at least 4,000 pounds worth of gates, 36 miles, to the hill overlooking Hebron. Why Hebron? Hebron is where Abraham is buried. Abraham's grave there then became sort of an object of Samson's violent, grunting, physical act of prophecy. It was the degenerate patriarch leaving the gates of their enemy as an offering to the redeemed patriarch, the one whose willingness to sacrifice his own son presaged the coming of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. That was more than 3,000 years ago. Fast forward to 1956. In Gaza, a young man named Roy Rotberg, who was a peace activist, lived in a kibbutz, which is a small farming community, very idealistically driven, very communitarian. He lived in this Nahal Oz kibbutz. And one morning he was patrolling on his horse. He saw some Arabs who were illegally picking produce from the kibbutz's fields. So he rode over to shoo them away. It was a trap. The infiltrators from Gaza shot and killed Roy and then horribly mutilated his corpse. The very next day, the kibbutz, in memory of Roy, invited the IDF chief of staff, Moshe Dayan, you probably have seen his picture before, to give the eulogy. And his eulogy, which is just 238 words long, is the Israeli equivalent of the Gettysburg Address. So every Israeli would know this. And he said in his address, "But beyond the furrow that marks the border lies a surging sea of hatred and vengeance, yearning for the day that the tranquility blunts our alertness, for the day that we heed the ambassadors of conspiring hypocrisy who call for us to lay down our arms." And then he said this, "Roy, the light in his heart blinded his eyes, and he saw not the flash of the blade. The longing for peace deafened his ears, and he heard not the sound of the coiled murderers. The gates of Gaza were too heavy for his shoulders, and they crushed him." Fast forward to October 7th, 2023. 3,000 terrorists managed to permeate the border and cross into southern Israel on a Shabbat morning when people would be just resting and unable and unreally prepared to defend themselves. They swarmed into the Israeli communities, into the kibbutzim, into military bases, destroying the crops, but killing, raping, and mutilating men, women, and children alike. By the end of that day, and they actually preceded that with shooting missiles, not just a few, not just 5 or 10, 14,000 missiles Hamas shot into Israel. By the end of that day, 1,200 Israeli civilians had been killed, many of them living in kibbutzim in southern Israel with the specific personal mission of reaching out to the Gazans and giving them employment and helping them in their lives, giving them medical care so that they could bring peace between Gaza and Israel. That day, homes were bombed and destroyed in these southern communities. Maybe the most horrifying thing of all you probably saw in the news was that a music festival, an all-night dance rave, which I don't personally understand. But the young people from Israel all got together in this place, and it's an acacia grove. It's beautiful. If you've ever been to Southern California, it's just like that. The terrorists attacked those young people. They killed hundreds of them. Many of them were told by the police, "Get in your car and flee if you can." The terrorists shot at them until they killed the driver and then threw incendiary grenades inside, burning them alive. Here's a picture of that site of that Nova Music Festival, which has become an impromptu memorial in southern Israel. I would have thought, because I work with young adults, I would have thought that this kind of attack would have led young adults in the United States of America to rise up and say, "We will not, in our generation, permit Jewish people to be attacked like this. We will stand up. We will defend them. We will talk to our Jewish neighbors and let them know that we will not let them be bullied in this way if we can say anything about it." But in fact, to my shock, the exact opposite happened. In November, and then again in December, the Harvard CAPS organization did a poll with the Harris organization, and they asked this question: do you think the Hamas killing of 1,200 Israeli civilians and the kidnapping of another 250 civilians can be justified by the grievances of Palestinians, or is it not justified? Now you look at that little chart there, that little pie graph, and you realize 73% of Americans said it is not justified. But then look down at the column below. Between of those who are 18 to 24 in the month of December, 60% said that killing and kidnapping was justified because of Palestinian grievances. And I thought, here I've been working with this generation for years and I don't even know them. I do not recognize the ideology of a person who would literally say that it is okay to slaughter, rape, and mutilate civilians if you're mad. But that's what's going on. I think some of it just doesn't come from a particular concern about Israel or the Palestinians. It comes from a general anti-American attitude. Whereas 73% of older Americans say they are proud to live in the United States, only 16% of those in Gen Z say they are proud to live in the United States. And so what happened as a result, as you saw in the news over the last several months, was an open celebration of Hamas as an organization and its tactics by the young adults in the United States of America. Now, some people have said to me, you don't know that. You don't know that all of those people there were there to promote Hamas. Maybe they just felt sorry for the Palestinians. And I will admit that that is true. But I think there were two kinds of people protesting. There were people who understood exactly what was going on, and there were people who didn't understand what was going on, and they should have known better. Khalid Mashal, who is like a god figure to Hamas because he once survived an assassination attempt. He is the external leader of Hamas. One of the other three external leaders was killed in Iran just a couple of weeks ago. Khalid Mashal has gained a net worth of $5 billion by skimming off of international aid designated for destitute Gazans. And in his public appearances, he gives media interviews. This is what's astounding to me. Hamas has never been unclear about exactly what they intend to do and why they exist. They've written it out in charters. They've talked about it in documents. They even wrote out a 16-page defense of their attacks on killing of 1,200 Israeli civilians. I'll show you something about that in just a moment. But I think a lot of Americans don't know because we assume that if anybody has anything important to say, they'll say it in English. Right? But the Hamas leaders do not speak in English. They speak in Arabic to the media. So I found some individuals who were taking these media transcripts and translating them from Arabic into English so I could understand what is going on. In one interview, this Khalid Mashal said this: the Palestinian nation is just like any other nation. No nation is liberated without sacrifices. He went on to specifically recall the sacrifices made by communists in the Soviet Union, by communists in Angola, communists in Vietnam, and so forth, and made it clear in the interview, he does not care if every single civilian in Gaza dies, as long as Hamas is able to achieve its aim, number one aim, primary aim, which is the annihilation of the state of Israel. Incredibly, after October 7th, Hamas put out a 16-page brochure called Our Narrative, Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. By the way, the Palestinian protesters at the DNC called their operation last week Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. This narrative, first of all, I just thought that was such an odd phrasing. If you were in court and the judge asked you what happened, and you said, well, my narrative is, the judge would probably say, why don't you skip your narrative and just tell the truth? This is what they said in their narrative. The Palestinian resistance was fully disciplined and committed to the Islamic values during the operation, and the Palestinian fighters only targeted the occupation soldiers and those who carried weapons against our people, and that the Palestinian fighters were keen to avoid harming civilians. This is all a lie, and the entire world knows it. I was so upset by the convergence of all of these different polls and this kind of information coming out that just before Thanksgiving last fall, I wrote an opinion editorial piece for the Daily Wire. You may have seen it. It was called, "Congratulations, America, You've Raised a Generation of Terrorist Sympathizers." That got some attention. And it led, among other things, to an opportunity to join a small group of leaders to go back to Israel, to the war zone, to personally interview all kinds of people and to examine what was happening in that situation. I was able to talk to people who were secular Jews and religious Jews, people who were Jews, people who were Arabs, Palestinians, Israelis, journalists, an intelligence officer, people from the IDF, even the person who was responsible for preparing the female victims' bodies for burial. I personally met with survivors. I personally met with members of families who have hostages, many of whom are still alive and in captivity in Gaza to this day. I want to tell you just a little bit about that trip. And then I want to sort of draw some lessons from this that I think can help us understand what is going on. Because if you have Jewish friends, you know that there is still tension here. There's tension between Christians and Jews. Jews are very grateful for the support of Christians, but they do not understand Christians at all. They're a little bit suspicious, or a lot suspicious, of our motives. Some of them think that our end times prophecies are strange. Some of them wonder why we're so keen to protect Israel when we don't have a personal stake in the issue. What is our hidden motivation? But as I went there, it was difficult from the moment I decided to go. Only one airline was still going there, the Israeli national airline, El Al. So I booked an El Al flight, and they asked, "Why are you going? Don't you know we're at war?" And I said, I've been there before. I'm meeting a small group of people. We're going to go over there and examine the situation. Well, that did not strike the security officers as a very good reason. They literally went through every article in both my backpack and my bag. I finally did make it to Israel. I got to the Tel Aviv airport, which is usually packed with thousands of pilgrims. Nobody there. I think there were 5 people in front of me in a line. And when I got up to the counter, by then I thought through what I should say. And the person behind the counter asked me, "Have you ever been to Israel before?" "Yes, I have." I said, "I came here last year. And I think it was 2009. She looked at me and said, 2008. I was like, "Oh, okay. Guess it was 2008. She asked, "Why are you here? Don't you know we are at war?" I said, "I'm here to show solidarity." She stamped the passport, shoved it back in my direction, and said, "Solidarity with whom?" And I realized the level of tension that the entire nation was experiencing had led every person to be on edge. I got to Jerusalem. The streets were eerily empty. It's extraordinary to have empty streets in Jerusalem at any hour of the day, except on Shabbat. They were empty. We had a briefing from an intelligence officer, and the next morning we traveled with our security guard to Gaza. Along the way, you know immediately that you're getting into a war zone, first of all, because the roads go from smooth to rough, because the tanks are traversing the roads and have torn up all of the asphalt. The second thing you notice as you drive along is there's smoke arising off in the distance, which you can see and smell anywhere you are in southern Israel. These are terrorist hideouts that have been targeted by Israeli artillery. We arrived, as you drive along, all along the road, like bus stops, you see these big concrete boxes. These are bomb shelters. We were told in our security briefing, where we are going in southern Israel is so close to Gaza that if they shoot a rocket, you have 7 seconds to take cover. There are even some of these. Every parking lot has one. You see them all along the road. Even playgrounds have them smiled up a little bit so that children won't be terrified to go inside and protect themselves from the constant rocket attacks that have been coming for dozens of years from Gaza. When we arrived at Kfar Aza, which is one of the kibbutzim in that region that had been attacked, we were issued Kevlar helmets and body armor. And the reason why, you can see that there's a fence right behind me there. On the other side of that fence, that's one of the cities of Gaza. It's literally close enough that if snipers decided to take a shot in our direction, they could actually hit us. As we toured the devastation, we realized immediately what it meant that these communities had been attacked and people had been slaughtered. If you've ever been in a place where a natural disaster took place, you know that the homes are cleared by putting spray painted markings on the outside. This particular spray painted marking that you can see over on the upper left-hand side has a circle with a dot inside. That means a body was found inside of that home. Nearly every home had a circle with a dot. Seeing the red markings reminded me of the Israelites being in the land of Egypt. They were told by God, put blood markings on your doors so the angel of death will pass over. There was no passing over here. Literally 10% of the people who lived in this community were slaughtered, including the community's doctor and his wife. And their 10-month-old children were left screaming inside their safe room. Anyone who came to try to rescue them was killed. From Kfar Aza, we went to the city of Sderot. This again would just look like a California town. I was thinking of Camarillo or someplace like that north of Los Angeles, where there are palm trees and the roads are beautiful and there are lots of interesting stores and houses and apartments and very modern looking things. In Sderot, we went down to the new police headquarters. I asked, why do they have a new police headquarters? They said, well, they had hired a janitor to come in and clean their old police headquarters from Gaza to give them a good job. And he made a map of the entire facility. So when the terrorists came to Sderot, they immediately went to the police station, knew every corridor, every room, and they slaughtered 20 police officers, so that then the people of the community would not have any defense against everything else the terrorists did. In the new police station, we watched a lot of footage. I will have nightmares about the footage as long as I live. Weirdly, the footage that disturbed me the most wasn't footage of blood and bodies. That's very disturbing to see, because these are real people. These were real individuals who were slaughtered in the most unimaginable ways. I think the most disturbing video was from a CCTV camera. When the terrorists came into town, they shot and disabled a car. Out of the car jumped a father who grabbed a little girl out of the back seat and ran, body hunched over, trying to protect her from the gunfire. He was felled by the terrorists, and the little girl jumped up out of his arms, holding her hands over her ears, running back down the street, desperately trying to find her mother. That little girl is an orphan. Both parents were killed. By that evening, we toured a military base as well that had been attacked, and then met with the IDF soldiers and hosted a dinner for them to say thank you for their work. Most of these individuals left their homes on October 7th, reported to their base, and had not been back 100 days later. Unlike the United States of America, Israel doesn't have what we would think of as a professional military. The people who are in the military are citizen soldiers. They're everyday people who left their jobs. The major who gave us the tour around the base that afternoon was a professor at the University of Tel Aviv who writes on political affairs in Arabic, Hebrew, and English. In fact, he's politically very different from where I am, which I thought was really interesting. I was thinking at the same time, this is the kind of guy that I warn my students at Summit Ministries against. And also, he's standing up in defense of his nation. There are a lot of contradictions that you experience in the process. But out of that dinner tent, we sat there and stayed with individuals. I talked to a young man named Alex. He had only been involved in this particular military unit for 1 week. I asked him, Alex, what do you do in civilian life? And he says, I drive a train. I said, oh, you're an engineer. That's what we call it in the United States. And he just laughed and said, I'm not an engineer. I just drive. Alex we talked about faith for a few minutes, and he said that his father had become a Christian, and he showed me a little icon that he carried around in his pocket that his father had given to him. After a little while, I stepped outside of the tent and I saw one of the Israeli soldiers that I had met earlier in the day. Everybody carries weapons there. And he asked me, do you want an espresso? I don't know, man. I'm going to have a hard enough time falling asleep as it is. He said, I'll make one for myself and we can talk. So he climbed into the back of his van where he had an espresso machine, just like the one I have at home, made himself an espresso, climbed back down out of the van. And by the time he climbed back down, I was cold and wishing that I had accepted an espresso. But as he sipped his espresso, he said something that I think I'll remember for the rest of my life. He said, a lot of people say the individuals who did this are monsters, that they're not even human. It's not true. They are human just like us, but they went to a dark place and they did evil things. And while this man would not claim a faith that's recognizable to us, he understood something intuitively that we understand from a biblical worldview. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. There were some opportunities to do interviews, which I thought that was very strange. And I asked, why do you want to, you don't know me. I mean, I do interviews here in the States, but why would anybody there know that? And they said, we didn't know that you did interviews in the States. We're just looking for somebody who can speak coherent English.
Hey, it's Dr. Jeff Myers. Almost nobody is excited about politics, but here's something exciting in the political season. Summit Ministries has produced a new course. It debunks 4 myths that keep Christians sidelined, and it's free for you to use with your family, your small group, your church, any way you see fit. Just go to summit.org/politics. Here's a quick trailer. So let me get this on the table. Most people hate politics. 65% of people say it makes them exhausted. 55% say it makes them angry. 4% say they get excited. When they're asked to choose words about how to describe politics, some of those I can't say on a family-oriented video. A lot of people in church don't want to talk about politics, especially in election years. Because it seems to divide people, we can't get unity. But is unity easy? Well, if you're married, is unity in your marriage easy? No. Is it worth it? Yes. But it takes good discussion. It takes mutual trust. It takes a common understanding of the core principles that make blessing and flourishing possible. In this course, we're going to talk about the 4 myths that keep Christians sidelined when it comes to politics. God doesn't care about politics. It's not my problem. Choosing between the lesser of 2 evils is a self-evil. Politics doesn't matter to what's really important.
So what's going on in this situation? What background do we need to have in order to really grapple with what is taking place and what our role as Christians is, and how Jews relate to who we are as Christians? Because as Adam mentioned, there's a lot of controversy about this, especially among those in Gen Z. Support for Israel among Gen Z evangelical Christians, young adults, has dropped in half within the last 5 years. This is not just within the last year. Something's been going on that we need to try to understand and grapple with. In order to make sense of it, we first of all have to understand what Judaism is. So what does it mean to be Jewish? Well, Judaism is a set of beliefs and practices as well as a cultural identity. Somebody might be Jewish. Ordinarily, people would be allowed to immigrate to Israel if their mother had been Jewish, so that the lineage goes through the mother, which is interesting if you think through some of the lineage that you're given in the Gospels about the lineage of Jesus Christ. So it would go through your mother, but there are a lot of people, they can only trace it back so many generations, but that's how you would ordinarily do it. But it isn't just what your DNA is. It isn't even just what your religion is. It's a whole set of beliefs. It's very broad. In Scripture, Judah, which in Hebrew would be pronounced Yehuda, was the son of Jacob, whom God had renamed Israel. Remember this from the Old Testament. Well, the tribe of Judah became dominant in the nation to the point that the people became known as Jews. From that point forward, Jews were thought of as those who made up the people group known as Israel. Does that make sense? Judaism is the creed of these people. Judaism is based on the writings of the Hebrew Bible, which there's almost complete convergence between if you ask somebody, what does it say in the Tanakh? They might be very surprised to understand that that's basically our Old Testament. And there are also subsequent revered writings and interpretations that make up Judaism. Israel itself is very diverse. There are people, migrants from 103 different countries speaking 82 different languages. Just being in the nation of Israel, you immediately realize that this white settler colonialist label that Israelis are branded with is anything but true. It's actually quite the opposite, extremely diverse. In fact, it's politically diverse. Oddly, in the United States of America, we have 2 dominant political parties and probably 5 others that battle things out every 4 years. In Israel, there are 55 political parties for 9 million people. And 15 of them have seats in the Knesset, which is their parliament. The majority party, Likud, which is the party of Benjamin Netanyahu, only holds 32 out of the 120 seats. So the only way things ever get done in Israel is if people form coalitions with those who agree with them on some things, even if they disagree with them on other things. They would understand the principle that you don't forsake your 80% friends because of the 20% where you disagree. You cannot do that and survive as a nation there. Here's the point that I think brings this back to who we are as Christians. The existence of a people chosen by God is a constant reminder that there is a God and that he has a plan for the world. People wonder, they ask about every aspect of that. I was asking one of my Jewish friends, he's an attorney for a prominent law firm in Israel. I said, what explains this embrace of Hamas and the hatred of Israel? And he said, there's only one explanation. These people genuinely hate God and want to tear down anything that God is doing. I found that later to be true. All of the Palestinians I talked to about this would say things like, Israel is the little Satan. Oh, really? And what's the big Satan? The United States of America. They understand exactly what is going on here. The attacking of Israel is attacking a proxy of the United States. Everything that is done to Israel is what these terrorists wish they could do to the United States and may at some point do if they are not defeated. So what does it look like then to have a biblical view of this issue? There are 4 things I want to focus on. After this, I'll give you a couple more stories, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and do about 30 minutes of Q&A. So if you have questions that you'd like to ask, I'm used to challenging questions. That's completely fine with me. I work with 16 to 22-year-olds. I've done about somewhere around 50 media interviews, many of them national, in the last 6 weeks since the book came out. And there's a lot of interest. We printed 45,000 copies of that book. They're gone. They're sold out in the first 6 weeks. So we're going back and reprinting them. But one of the interviewers said, I'm really sorry if my questions were tough. I said, hey, I do work with 1,700 young people in Q&A sessions every summer. Trust me, your questions are not tough. So I'm okay if they're tough questions, completely fine. But there are 4 points I want to make to kind of set up the discussion. The first one we need to understand from a biblical viewpoint is that God is a God of history. God is a God of history. At the center of the Judeo-Christian worldview is a God of history who has revealed himself in history. God created, humans fell into sin, God brought redemption through Christ, and he is restoring all things. That work will continue until the end of time when God will make his dwelling with humanity. That's what Revelation chapter 21 says. It's important for us to know and to teach to every generation that history isn't a random series of events. History is going somewhere, and it is going there on purpose. And God is guiding it, and he will not be stopped. The second thing to remember is that all human beings have value as image bearers of God. Genesis chapter 1 says, God said, let us make man in our image and in our likeness. Both of those terms, image and likeness, have a very strong connotation in Hebrew. You almost could say, let us make a facsimile of ourselves. Let's make a copy of ourselves. This is a powerful thing to realize that God is a creator and we can be creative. God is relationship. Christian theology teaches us that there's one God in 3 persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Communication then in the Godhead, relationship is not just something that God does, it's something God is by his very nature. So we have also been given the ability to relate. Ancient Israel was built on two principles. This is significant to realize because a lot of people look back at ancient Israel and say, see, it was a theocracy. It was a theocracy. God alone guided it. And then people will say, and that's why if you let Christians get in charge, the whole world is going to look like a Handmaid's Tale. It's going to be evil, because these people, all they want to do is take control of all the rest of us, which, by the way, is a projection of what they would like to do if they got into power. But that's a side point. It is important to understand that Israel was not a theocracy in the way that we think of it. It was a constitutional republic. Does that ring any bells? That's what the United States of America is. Why are we a constitutional republic? Well, it's fascinating. If you look back at the founders, and there was a professor named Dr. Lutz who looked at all of the documents, and he realized that the founders of the United States of America quoted from the Bible more than all other sources put together. They weren't just quoting a Bible verse here or there to justify their particular point of view. They were literally trying to figure out what was the nature of the Hebrew government that was given by God. Because if we can come close to that, then maybe our government will last a long time. So there were three parts to it. There was a leader who was not a king. That was Moses and then Joshua. And then second of all, there was a legislature. You remember Moses' father-in-law said, select people to be representatives of the 10, of the 100, of the 1,000. So it was a sort of a legislative system. There was also a court system. And that is why you have the last half of the book of Exodus and the book of Leviticus. When you're looking at the book of Leviticus, I know a lot of people try to read through the Bible. Most Bible reading plans die in Leviticus. Like, oh my goodness. I remember reading to my kids once out of Exodus, thou shalt not boil a baby goat in its mother's milk. And one of my daughters who loves animals just burst into tears. Why would anybody even think about doing that? That was a pretty rough evening. Those are all court cases. They're summaries of court cases. And those court cases helped the constitutional republic solve its difficulties. There are several themes that emerge through them. One of the clear themes through those court cases is you must protect women and children from abuse. Another one is that you have to organize society such that that people who have diseases don't spread their diseases among everybody else. The whole idea of a quarantine, the 40 days, came from the ancient Hebrews. Those judges figured that if we could get people who are really sick to not spread it, set them aside for a little period of time, then the rest of the nation can be healthier. There were laws on sanitation. There were laws to protect the environment. A lot of the laws were about having animals have dignity. If a man digs a pit and an ox or donkey falls into a pit and dies, then the one who dug the pit shall make the restoration. That they're protective of property rights, they're protective of animals, all of those kinds of things are part of it. But there were two core principles that animated that ancient constitutional republic. The first one in Hebrew is tzedakah, which is the state of society in which justice reigns. The second one was mishpat, which is what is needed to restore justice from injustice. Believe it or not, this is the same way our legal system operates in the United States today. The first part, the legal system, how do you develop a state of society in which justice reigns? You have protections against criminal activity. The second part of it, mishpat, what is needed to restore justice from injustice, is both how you punish people who have violated the law and how you protect the rest of society from those individuals and their actions, and also how you restore when something has gone wrong. If somebody gets crashed into by a car, the law specifies that that person has to make it right. Through their insurance company, they have to either repair the car, pay your medical bills, or get you a new car or whatever it happens to be. That's called tort law, and it comes directly from the ancient Hebrew law. That is the way our system operates to this day. So the Old Testament of the Bible, as you're well aware, chronicles a lot of injustice, and some of it is on the part of Israel, some of it's on the part of its enemies, and it also chronicles a lot of efforts to restore justice. There are a lot of different ways that happened. One of them was military conquest. Another would be through political development. Another would be through religious revival. The military conquest aspect of that probably will come up in the Q&A time, so we'll hold off on that. Does this make sense so far? So for the first one was that God is a God of history. The second one is that all human beings have value as image bearers of God. The third one, and this is controversial for a lot of Christians today, the earth and our physical bodies and our place in it matters. The earth matters. A lot of Christians today say, well, it doesn't really matter. That basically we're just spirits with containers that are our bodies. A biblical worldview doesn't teach that. In fact, a biblical worldview specifically teaches against, you saw this in the writings of the Apostle John, teaches against a doctrine that was common in New Testament times called Gnosticism. Gnosticism, or secret knowledge, gnosis, was the idea that our relationship with God is spiritual and has nothing to do with the physical world, so we should live as if we are disembodied creatures. This, by the way, is behind a lot of ideologies that you see in our culture today, including the whole issue of transgenderism. This is not just about gender insecurity. This is about a belief that I am whatever I feel I am, regardless of my physical body. That's the idea of Gnosticism. The Apostles' Creed, incidentally, which you probably have read at some point in time, well, we recited a lot at Summit Ministries, is a line-by-line refutation of Gnostic claims. The earth really matters. And then the fourth one is that God chose to work through the Jewish people to carry out his plans for the world. Now, I'm going to use two different passages here that tie the Jewish people together with Christians today. The first one is Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. And this may be ground that you've already covered, but I'd like to go ahead and emphasize it anyway. In Genesis chapter 12, God communicates with a man named Abram. And he says, Abram, I'm choosing you. You are going to be the father to many nations. Your children will outnumber the sand and the seashores and the stars in the sky. And Abram couldn't figure out how that would be true because he was a very old man and his wife was elderly as well. And how could he possibly be the father to many nations? But God specified that they were going to make a covenant together. Covenant is a very specific kind of agreement, one that's so serious you literally seal it with your life. And the way you seal it with your life, and this is what was traditionally done, is they would sacrifice an animal, divide the pieces of the animal, and the parties to the covenant would walk through the middle, saying, in essence, if I violate this covenant, may what was done to these animals be done to me. That is serious. Nobody signs agreements like that today. Here's the amazing part. Abram prepared the animals, the sacrifices. He set out the pieces. And then God came and put Abram into a deep sleep, and God alone walked through the pieces. So we call it the Abrahamic covenant. But technically, it was not a covenant between God and Abraham. It was a covenant that God made with himself on behalf of Abraham. So when we talk about the idea that God is the one who secures our salvation, that's where that idea comes from. That it's about God, that God alone decides whether somebody is out of the covenant. Then you move on to Galatians chapter 3, verses 6 to 9. This is an extraordinary passage. I encourage you to read it when you go home this evening. Galatians chapter 3, verses 6 to 9. The Apostle Paul says that what was taught to Abraham was the gospel. This passage says the gospel was announced in advance to Abraham. You're like, wait a second, the gospel is about Jesus. Yes, it is. And it was announced in advance to Abraham through this covenantal process, so that those who believe in Jesus are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. That we have been brought into, by God's mercy, this covenant that was originally given to the father of the Jewish people. Now, this is a fascinating thing. When you look at this, you realize, I put the summary point up there, that God's covenant with Israel was from God through Israel to the nations. So what does it mean to be grafted into that covenant? That's the language you see the Apostle Paul use in Romans 9, 10, and 11. What does it mean to be grafted in? It means that God has brought us here to this earth at this particular time to be a blessing to the nations of the earth. We are inheritors of that covenant. So why do people think that modern day Israel has nothing to do with it? There are a couple of reasons. Number one, when people were developing all their theological categories, you remember Luther, Calvin, some of those guys, when they were developing their theological categories, Israel did not exist as a nation. It had been wiped out. This happened before, and Israel came back together and was reconstituted, but it didn't exist as a physical place at the time those theological categories were developed. So then when Israel came back into existence in 1948, all of those theological categories didn't take that into account. They all said, oh, Israel is just a spiritual metaphor, not a physical place. Why would you say that? Well, because it doesn't exist. But it does exist now. Well, yeah, but it's not relevant. Like, what? So I'm hearing theologians say things like this. I've actually had somebody say to me, modern Israel has nothing to do with ancient Israel. Now, one of the questions I always ask in this situation is, how do you know that's true? I just ask, how do you know that's true? Well, because it's modern. So? Why? It was reconstituted before and we still called it Israel. Why wouldn't we call this Israel? It's clearly a Jewish state. By the way, there's only one Jewish state in the entire world. There are 57 countries that are members of the Organization of Islamic States. There are 1.9 billion Muslims in the world, 15 million Jews. There are 120 Muslims for every Jew. So this is a tiny little group. Half of them live in Israel. I said, why would you say it's not relevant? It is acknowledged as a Jewish state. Its basic law, which is its constitution-like government, is based on the book of Deuteronomy. Its national traditions come directly from the Old Testament. Of this 9 million citizens, 7 million of them are Jews. So it's odd when you hear people talk about this, but I think usually people misunderstand it because they haven't gone back and looked at the idea that God is a covenant-keeping God. Does that make sense? All right. So, why then do we have this problem with the rising generation? I'll kind of draw this hopefully to a little bit of a conclusion. We did a poll back at the end of March. I had been trying to find polls that would accurately represent what the rising generation believes. And polling is a tricky science. Usually they'll randomly pick out maybe 1,000 or 1,200 people from the whole country. So when you take one of these polls, you're representing just about everybody your age in the whole country. So what you say may not be entirely in keeping with what other people believe, but they have a formula to figure it out. That's why you always see what the poll says, plus or minus 3 points, whatever. Somewhere in this range is what people typically believe. We oversampled Gen Z to make sure that our results for the rising generation were extremely accurate. We found that in the poll, while the majority of Americans still support Israel, nearly half of Gen Z voters say the campaign against Hamas is unjust, and 1 in 3 of Gen Z believe that Israel does not have a right to exist as a country. Literally does not have a right to exist as a country. That quite literally is the definition of anti-Semitism. So what's going on? Well, I remember when I was a young adult, I was on the debate team at my school, and our school was in Kansas, and a lot of the debates were, all Eastern schools or down in Texas or whatever. So we get on airplanes and we go through airports, and we met a lot of people from cults. One cult, Hare Krishna, another cult. This is followers of a guy named Lyndon LaRouche. I mean, you may not have even heard of these. They may not be around anymore, but those were very prominent. They would go to the airports. They would hand out brochures. They would yell at people. It was all very exciting. And I realized when I was looking at these results from Gen Z that I was seeing almost a cult-like devotion that I think might have explained it. There are 4 marks of somebody who's involved in a cult, and the first one is behavior control. You're not allowed to say anything different or we will shame you. The second one is information control. We make sure that you're only getting information from certain sources. Don't believe anybody who's not on TikTok, kind of thing. The third one is thought control. Thought control is you're not even allowed to think things that are out of alignment with what we are telling you. And the fourth one is emotional control. We're going to control your emotions so that you're sad only about the things that we're sad about, and you're happy only about the things that we are happy about. That is how cults operate. So I thought, well, if that's true, if we have kind of this cult mind control that's going on in an entire generation, certainly is true with Hamas, certainly true there. But what do we do in our generation? Dr. Stephen Hassan is the main guy who helps people come out of mind control cults. He's written about how to do this. And I thought this is fascinating because he is not a Christian believer. He said this, with all the cult members I meet, I try to remember that they are enslaved. They are enslaved. That is consonant with Scripture. 2 Timothy 2:23-26 tells us what to do when people are enslaved. It says, have nothing to do with foolish, ignorant controversies. You know that they breed quarrels. And the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponents with gentleness. God may perhaps grant them repentance, leading them to a knowledge of the truth, and they may come to their senses and escape from the snare of the devil after being captured by him to do his will. It's a mouthful. But the Apostle Paul is saying to his young protege, listen, when people are enslaved, you have to act differently. If somebody believes something because they're stubborn, and they just want, to show that they're smart and everybody else is stupid and that you don't get it and blah, 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 you would treat that in a particular way. But if somebody is enslaved, they're not choosing to remain enslaved. Anybody who's been through addiction will tell you, at first I chose that drug, and after every second after that, it chose me. I was enslaved to it, they will tell you. That's why you have to have specific interventions in those situations. But you would treat somebody who's enslaved differently. You would have compassion on them because they can't really help themselves very much right now. So how do you help them? I think if I could summarize this entire passage into 2 words, it would be caring concern. We show caring concern. The main way to show caring concern, I think, is through the power of questions. I'd like to share these with you briefly, give a story, close, we'll take our break and come back for the Q&A. Sound good? All right. The power of questions. Questions like, would you be willing to tell me what you are thinking? With the young adults that I've worked with this summer, because the Israel book was out, there were a lot of them who had questions about that specifically. So I started setting up question and answer sessions with them. And a lot of them would say, listen, this isn't something that we really talk about in our generation. And I will ask why. And they say, well, it has entered into the realm of non-thought. That's my term, but that's what it's entered into the realm of non-thought. This is the one thing you can't talk about. Like you can't talk about abortion because everybody knows that a woman has a right to choose abortion if she wants. If you say anything different, we have to marginalize you, hate you, despise you, say nasty things about you to your friends and so forth. Okay, it's entered into non-thought with this generation. Socialism, similar thing. With this rising generation, socialism has entered into the realm of non-thought. If you're not socialist, you must be a cruel, uncaring person. Okay, and then also with the Israel issue. Of course you support the Palestinians. Every reasonable person who has an ounce of compassion supports the Palestinians against the Israelis. That's how they view it. So sometimes they don't even want to talk about these kinds of issues. It's triggering is the term that they use. So what do? You ask a question. Would you be willing to tell me what you're thinking? Questions like this: how did you arrive at that conclusion? Or how do you know that's true? Ask questions that move it from the realm of non-thought back into the realm of thought. I find that with some young adults, I ask a question like this. It sounds like we have a major disagreement that may take some time to work through. I believe by talking about it, we can come closer to the truth. How do you see it? Those kinds of questions make it safe to think, to engage, to share some things. It takes a while to share. A lot of those in Gen Z, they don't want to talk about these issues because they believe that what they think is so different that they might end up realizing that their parents are Nazis or whatever. So they won't even want to discuss it. So you have to use questions to do it. We've also found that presenting facts to young adults makes a big difference. I'll give you this example from one of our polls. We asked this question: what about the fact that Israel has greater wealth and military power? Does that make its military campaign against Hamas unjust? 47% of those 18 to 24 said yes. Israel's greater wealth and military power makes its campaign unjust. You recognize what's going on here? This is kind of the Marxist oppressor versus oppressed framing, that everything has to be viewed through the lens of power. It came out right in that question. So then to those who said yes to that question, we asked this question: Hamas leaders have become wealthy by skimming international aid designated for Palestinian citizens. Do such actions on the part of Hamas leaders make their cause unjust? 57% immediately said yes. This is literally the next question in the poll. They changed their mind in one question. And then 23% now said not sure. They didn't want to say yes, but they didn't want to say no either. Listen, if somebody believes something bad, if they're not sure about it, that's better than if they're sure about it. So what we found is a lot of the people who are protesting don't really know why. They don't really know what's going on. And earlier I said something critical about them, but I'll be a little bit more gentle in this instance. They haven't really thought about it. Pollsters went out and surveyed the protesters. They were chanting, "From the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free." So the pollsters just asked them, what river and what sea? Okay. Listen, 55% of the protesters could not name either the river or the sea that they were chanting about. Why are they out there? Well, because we taught them all of their lives growing up that you should stand up against a bully. Don't be a bully, and if you see a bully, do whatever you can to stand up against them. What we don't realize is how that basic teaching has been weaponized by teachers in schools who've taught them that everything in the world could be simplified into an oppressor versus the oppressed. And we will tell you who the oppressors are so that you will know who to stand against. I know some people are thinking, oh man, this is a lot more than I bargained for when I came over here tonight. I didn't know we're going to get into all this detail, statistics. My wife, Stephanie, said you can only use one statistic per talk. So can we all agree that we're not going to tell Steph what I just did? All right. It's hard. It is hard. One of the people I met with in Israel was Rachel Goldberg. Her son, Hirsch, is one of the hostages held hostage to this day. We have reason to believe he is alive. We're praying that he is. But Rachel put it this way: it is hard, but hard is not bad. Hard is just hard. Hard is not bad. Hard is just hard. You know what's the strangest thing you learn when you go to Israel? How happy the people are. It's bizarre. If you've been there, you know they yell at each other. Like they have a protest and they have a counter protest, and then at 9:00 they shake hands and go home. Like, what? Israel, according to surveys, is the 4th happiest nation in the world. And they are surrounded by enemies who all want them dead. 4th happiest nation in the world. United States is 15th. We think that we can escape our problems. If I live in Colorado Springs, if Colorado Springs becomes too dangerous, I can always move someplace safe, like Chicago. I always think I can run away. I met with a rabbi. Sadly, one of his sons was killed on October 7th. It was a very emotional meeting. But one thing he said to me I thought was really important. He said, the problem with running away is that you're always taking yourself with you. He said, actually, we may be better off than you Americans because we do not have the illusion that we can run away. We are right here. One of my meetings was with a journalist named Amir Tabom. Amir works for a newspaper. I don't know how to say this charitably. His newspaper is so far left that it makes the New York Times look conservative. It's called Haaretz. There's a big diversity of viewpoints in Israel. Not in Gaza, not among the Palestinians. No diversity of thought is allowed. But in Israel, it's very diverse, sometimes tense. But Amir lived in that kibbutz that I mentioned, Nahal Oz, where Roy Rothberg was killed. And on October 7th, he and his family barricaded themselves into their safe room, which they had turned into their children's bedroom. A safe room is a room in the house that has been reinforced through concrete and rebar to be able to withstand a direct rocket attack. Of course, the safe room wasn't all that safe for a lot of families on October 7th because the safe rooms had doors, but they didn't have locks because missiles don't attack through doors. And then the terrorists were able to force some of those doors open, throw in grenades, and kill all of those who were inside. But in Amir's case, they were able to keep themselves, their two children, his wife and their two children in their room until his father, who was a retired military general, arrived. It's a fascinating story. You probably heard it in the news. So I asked Amir, as he was telling us all of this, are you going back to Nahal Oz? And he said, we are going back. I said, now, I got to tell you, I can't imagine doing that. I can't imagine going back into the community where my neighbors were slaughtered. I can't imagine trying to raise children there. I said, as an American, I have to be honest with you. I don't know very many Americans who would go back. Why are you going back? And he said something to me I never expected. He said, it is our mission. Now, this guy, as far as I know, has no real belief in God. He's Jewish by heritage, but he's not there. And I asked him, so you have a mission, but you're not a believer. I mean, you're secular. What is your mission? He said, our mission is to go back and live next to the border where the terrorists came from to show them that they cannot win. And I asked him, but then how do you fight? You're not carrying weapons. And he said this, we fight through our presence. I think more than anything else, we need to be prepared to be people who go up to the gates of Gaza and are willing to be there. You know, Scripture tells us that Jesus took his followers to a place called Caesarea Philippi, and he told them there, upon you I will build this church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. You know this as well as I do. Gates are defensive weapons, not offensive weapons. You've never seen a movie where somebody said, hurry up, run, the gates are coming after us. No, you are going to the gates. You're going to the gates. And you're there with your presence, not because you can win, not because you're going to get some personal benefit out of it, but because your presence there, that courage shows a society that is waffling in indecision that there is something worth living for and even something worth dying for. And that may be the biggest part of our witness in the times in which we live.
Thank you so much for joining in this special episode of the Truth Changes Everything podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Israel or about the book, Should Christians Support Israel, you can just go to summit.org/Israel. And you're looking for that book called Should Christians Support Israel. The subtitle is Seeking a Biblical Worldview in an Impossible Situation. Just briefly, I argue in the book that a biblical worldview has the power to explain reality and to promote blessing and flourishing. And that's true even in what seems like an impossible situation. You ever face impossible situations? So to find more about this book and additional resources that Summit Ministries offers, you can just go to summit.org. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.